I do believe, given the current climate and the fact that we're sitting here today, it is surprising that I do not receive more complaints about emergency care. In terms of further speculating as to the reasons for this, I've had the opportunity to listen to much of the evidence before the panel via the uploads available on the inquiry website. Indeed, I was struck by the lack of reference to complaints by those responsible for managing our health and social care service who have contributed to this inquiry to date. It may be the case that concerns are being diverted to the serious adverse incident procedure, or that people are pursuing medical negligence claims, or that people's expectation of emergency services has been so reduced that many see little or no point in complaining to the relevant trust, let alone to my office. All of this, of course, Chairman, is only speculation on my part. I would also be keen to share some ideas with the inquiry in relation to serious adverse incident procedures and its interface with the health and social care complaints procedure. I am aware that the procedure was revised in October last year with a view to securing enhanced communication with and involvement of patients, families, carers, where a complaint is linked to a serious adverse incident investigation. However, given that often it can be the complaint from a patient, family, carer, etc., which leads to the initiation of an SAI procedure, I can understand why individuals become frustrated that the complaints process in many circumstances must cease in respect of those elements of their complaint which are deemed to be solely reliant on the outcome of the SAI investigation. I do, however, acknowledge and welcome that the revised procedure requires engagement with families, that their views are sought, that support has also been offered to them at an early stage, and that they have the opportunity to comment on the final draft of the report. In seeking their views, the importance of the first-hand witness evidence they can provide in relation to the detail of their experience or that of their loved one should, in my view, never be underestimated. Therefore, to my mind, a complaints investigation can be central to establishing the facts of an incident. Anecdotally, I'm aware that complainants often feel hugely disadvantaged in respect of the weight that is attached to their evidence when things go wrong. Specifically, they feel that because they cannot write in or have their views recorded in the patient's notes, or where no or inadequate notes exist, their experiences can be dismissed in favor of a response from a health professional, or at best they feel they are left with a completely unsatisfactory outcome because of a failure on a professional's part to maintain or document an accurate or adequate record of an event. Whilst as I've said, I cannot comment specifically on cases, I do wish to highlight a joint project that was funded by my office, I understate that, Chairman, funded by my office, with the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission, which for me, and I believe for the Commission, begins to place the patient experience at the centre of a complaints investigation. Humanising bureaucracy and improving services to people lie at the heart of my work, and upholding human rights is fundamental to achieving these goals. There will always be a tension between human rights principles and the reality of how public services are funded and experienced. The project that my office and the Human Rights Commission have undertaken is aimed at building on and around the human rights principles of FRIDA: fairness, respect, equality, dignity, and autonomy, into our consideration of a complaint. These principles are not new to healthcare staff, and the standards outlined in the DHSS PS document, Improving the Patient-to-Client Experience, and the 5 strands of the FRIDA principles are therefore the lens through which a patient's experience going forward will be tested when I get a complaint about healthcare to my office. Whilst the principles of good administration include getting it right, being customer-focused, being open and accountable, acting fairly and proportionately, putting things right, seeking continuous improvement, and there's the general standard I will apply in any complaint, that standard will now also be informed by FRIDA. These values are fundamentally important to human rights as they help identify the more specific standards relevant to a complaint and can also inform decisions on an appropriate remedy for those who have suffered injustice. In addition, there will be specific legal, policy, administrative, and professional standards that may also apply to the actions of a public authority in the particular circumstances of any complaint. Chairman, I'll be happy to take questions from you on how this project will be rolled out, and indeed questions on any other aspect of the work that I undertake as Commissioner for Complaints.
I wonder if you'd comment from your experience in healthcare services and in dealing as the Ombudsman, whether you think the absence of a complaint is necessarily a benchmark of satisfaction. So in other words, is the issue that there are very few complaints mean automatically that people are satisfied with the service? So where do you see kind of complaints in the overall scheme of things?
Well, I mean, I like the Minister, and I think like many people who have appeared before you, I do want to highlight that I'm very conscious of the outstanding work that's done every day by people in our A&E departments. And I think it's very important to preface our comments in that way. And indeed also to underwrite the Minister's point that there is a very high level of satisfaction on the part of most people leaving our health system and also emergency departments. But I think one couldn't equate, that being said, the absence of a complaint with satisfaction necessarily. You do undoubtedly, as the Commissioner complains, I wouldn't come anywhere near the vegetable shelf in Tesco's in terms of public interest. But I mean, I do hear, because I'm the Ombudsman, I suppose, Commissioner for Complaints, from many people about their experiences, many of which are very positive. But also I do think that there are people who haven't had a good experience, but do shrug their shoulders and say, what's the point? Nothing will ever be done about it. And as I've tried to indicate in my opening remarks, because the emergency engagement probably is over and maybe the illness is past or the circumstance has been dealt with, we'll get on with our lives and let it pass. So I think that in the nature of the emergency experience, which thankfully is how most people encounter emergency departments, I think there probably is a certain acceptance that complaints really serve no purpose and just, as someone might say in a Northern Ireland situation, get a life and move on. But I think for some people, and again, you've obviously had some very powerful witnesses in front of you, it's impossible to get on in terms of what happened. And then I think the whole complaints issue becomes hugely relevant and important.
My second of three questions is, what is your sense of, I'm looking at this now from your experience of both being a manager of services and in your Ombudsman role, but what is your sense of how effective the health service is in resolving complaints? And I'm thinking here across the piece, I mean, you've obviously said that there are very few in A&E. And do you have any particular suggestions for how the health service might improve the way they handle complaints?
Well, again, I'm going to ask Michaela maybe just to give you an overview, and then we can talk to maybe some specific issues, Chairman. Michaela.
I think our view would be that generally the complaints procedure operates fairly well. We do, though, receive some complaints about actual complaints handling itself, and that can be a bit of a measure of how well it is in fact doing. Complaints that we receive generally tend to be around the length of time taken outside of the target response time. That's in relation to complaints handling cases. But we are very much aware of the multifaceted nature of complaints handling and the importance of the individual facets to complainants. So for us, we're looking at, not only what the organisation decides, how they decide it, and how the complainant is treated in the process. We are of the view that there could be some more time spent on listening to the complainant at the outset. We have seen some investigations focus heavily on sort of incidental matters as opposed to the principal and contentious issues of complaint. But we do think there are times when the organisation needs to go beyond what the complainant has raised in their complaint in order to properly, fully and explain and respond to their concerns. And this is particularly important in issues where there's clinical complexity, because very often the complainant has little more to go on than really a sense that something has gone wrong. At times we have noticed a fragmented approach to complaints handling. A number of individuals can be asked to comment on a complaint or contribute to a complaint, but they have done so, or they do so in isolation of actually knowing who else has contributed, or indeed what the final corporate response to the complaint turns out to be. And at times, again, we have also noticed a poor degree of separation between the investigator and the issues that are being investigated and those who are in fact being investigated. So those are some of the issues, but generally we do think it operates well. It would be one of the more sophisticated procedures in terms of public services that we would be aware of.
And any particular suggestions you might have for improvements, or is there anything that you would particularly highlight for us in terms of our inquiry?
I think one of the things, and we would say it very often when we go out and speak to bodies, there is a need from the outset to explain to complainants the methodology that the organisation is adopting in investigating the complaint. So to state categorically up front, these are the people that we've spoken to, here's who conducted the investigation, here's how we've gone about it, here's the records that we've reviewed, here's where the records don't exist and they should exist. Here's the standards that applied, here's the guidelines, and again, just very much benchmarking them against what should have happened with what actually did happen. That's not always set out in a very clear, coherent manner, and it leads to more questions then from the complainant, and in turn more likely to come to our office.
Okay, my third and final question, I'm going to stray slightly into Paul's territory here, so with your Paul indulgence. You talked in your opening statement, Tom, about the work you've done on looking at the idea of a human rights framework for decision making. We heard from the Minister a degree of scepticism in terms of not arguing there was anything wrong with kind of human rights principles and values, but enshrining it in some kind of formal way, worries about that might become a charter for litigants or might come back to haunt the department. And I wondered, and therefore a degree of scepticism about working with that. I wondered, on the basis of your experience of developing the FRIDA principles and then trying to look at how you might apply them in practice, whether you think that scepticism is necessarily unfounded based on your experience or otherwise.
Well, I think that, I suppose, it's like all things. It's how you come to it. I think Professor Hunt shapes it in a particular way. I think there has been a significant shift in emphasis in terms of the human rights approach. And I think there was certainly, and I can say this as someone who was probably part of that rather sceptical group, there was a huge defensiveness on the part of leadership in health that we would be beaten over the head by lawyers who would come to demand the rights that were enshrined in the bill. And we sort of were already, and the Minister has said that, beleaguered by legal cases and a litigious public. I think that's now a much too narrow perspective to take. I think that the positives that we can get from this to really aspire to being human rights compliant in terms of an aspiration, as a belief this is how it should be. This is how people should experience our service. This is the standard we aspire to. And it strikes me that so often, everywhere I look, it's 1,000 voices, it's like a marketing campaign. But when you actually look at the values, they're the same values. The words are different. So I think we've got to stop using different words so that it can look like a new initiative, and actually start agreeing on some core words and values that we all will aspire to and commit to. And I think when you look at FRIDA and you look at who can be against fairness, who could be against respect, who could be against quality, who could be against dignity. I often say when I do talks to clinical actors, I have a simple concept in terms of how we should treat people, and it's the mother principle. How would I want my mother to be treated? So I would want FRIDA to apply. So if that is good enough for my mother, then it should be good enough for any other elderly woman who appears and is vulnerable and requires care and support. And clearly, in the pressure of the day and the problems that the health service experience, that's always going to be tested. But if we revisit it each time and say, well, did we deliver that today? Was that as good as we could be today? If that becomes the standard, then I think, and is articulated that way and leadership owns it, I think it becomes embedded in our culture, and then we have a totally different approach. What really is interesting to me, Chairman, and this is not to commend the Human Rights Commission for anything, but I do want to acknowledge that they forced me into this piece of work. I will now take all the credit for it, needless to say. But this manual is now being sought after across Europe by human rights leaders in terms of places like Poland, in places like Estonia, in places like Scandinavia, Sweden, Norway, because it's the first time that people have taken human rights and made them accessible in this way. And it allows our staff to embrace human rights. And that we were very skeptical, our people, of this particular approach. Now, it's not a panacea, it's not an end game in any way, but it's a critical starting point. And we would hope to engage with trusts in Northern Ireland and make clear to them this is the model we will now be looking at. And we will want to see evidence that FRIDA is being applied in the delivery system. And that to us is a way that they can then begin to look at how their services are delivered and review and audit their services. So I think it offers an opportunity for a beginning that will move to an agreed series of values that are described by everyone in the same way. And I think if we get that shared view, that shared commitment and understanding, we can move to the sort of world that mightn't necessarily deliver every day to every patient, but that should be the aspiration.
Thank you. Marion.
Good afternoon, Tom. Can I just follow on from a question that you have already answered, and then I have two questions of my own. You had said in response to a question and complaint that 2/3 of your caseload are health-related complaints, and in 2013-14 there was a 46% increase in health complaints. And then you noted that there was very few complaints coming through in relation to emergency care. And I'm wondering, is there any particular reason that you think those who have been treated in emergency care appear less likely to complain or haven't complained as the other health service users have?
Well, again, Chairman, I would take you back to my comments where I do think part of the problem is the nature of the encounter in the emergency department, I think, which by its nature can be fairly time limited in terms of the encounter. You can be waiting clearly, which is a big issue for people. But once that experience is behind them, the idea of formally complaining, I mean, it was interesting. I think, again, one of your witnesses made the point, one of your witnesses who had a very negative experience, and she said nowhere in the A&E department or the emergency department did she see any reference to complaints. I think that's what she said. Now that surprises me because there is a requirement on the trusts to publicize their complaints, procedures and processes. And actually in all of those processes there is specific reference to the Ombudsman's office. And in the event you're not satisfied with the response of your local trust, you have the right to take your complaint to the Ombudsman's office. So the fact that person should have the experience they had and not be aware of the complaints process certainly was of concern to me, and I intend to maybe take that up from the evidence given. I just think that people do get beyond the emergency experience and then decide there is no point. What is interesting is the people who were very powerful, who gave evidence to you, tended to have continuing conditions that were impacting them. And their I think, focus of their, without wanting to in any way represent them as a sort of a shared perspective, their focus was very clearly around the frustration of reappearing back in emergency departments with very, very complex conditions. And it was as though they had to start to climb the mountain all over again, as if no one ever heard of them. And again, I think it was highlighted, I think, in the South East Trust that the electronic record may address some of those issues. But certainly, I think my sense is that in the main, people coming into A&E, it's a very short encounter. The matter that they have a problem with gets addressed, or it moves on to their GP. So they then say, "What's the point?" That would be my overall impression. I don't know whether Michaela would like to say something.
Just really to add some more context around the numbers in our case handling volumes. In terms of our own office, last year we received around 370 written complaints about health and social care. 80% of those were about trusts, and that only equates to 4% of the total issues of complaints dealt with by trusts. So 4% of what the trusts are dealing with in terms of complaint are making it to our office, making their way to our office. In terms of what is actually being complained about, 50% of our complaints are about clinical care and treatment, 7% about the complaints handling itself, and only 4% about staff attitude and behaviour. And then currently, we currently have 103 investigations ongoing, and we estimate that around 5% of those relate to emergency care. So they're ongoing at the minute. One of the things maybe that I haven't prepared for today, we don't actually record our complaints in terms of programme of care, and that might be something we look to do in the future. And again, we wouldn't be aware of the numbers of complaints about emergency care that have been diverted to the SAI process, so I'm not sure if there's a larger proportion of those complaints dealt with under that process.
Thanks, Michaela. Turning now to my specific questions. There are particular groups of vulnerable clients, such as the elderly, children, those who are mentally ill or have disabilities, who experience difficulty accessing the complaints process. And I'm wondering, have you any views on how the systems can be made more accessible for those groups of individuals?
Well, I think there's a big issue for us as an office, without even talking about trusts. I think I would use the word failed. We have failed to really facilitate complaints from people with mental health problems, I would say. There was that magnificent piece of work done by Professor Bamford in terms of redesigning and reshaping. So much of that, unfortunately, seems to have been lost in the challenges of resources and other things. But I think we do really have to look particularly at learning disability and mental health as issues where we don't get sufficient. I mean, there must be more complaints there than we're receiving, and that's an issue for us. I don't necessarily see it as only an issue for trusts. I mean, I think older people, again, I think there's a number of advocacy organisations that are working for them. Now, clearly the people that must worry us most in that arena are people living alone, maybe without that level of support and sponsorship. And again, how we reach those is difficult. Rightly or wrongly, I've taken a view that it is not for an ombudsman, commissioner of complaints, and I'm not being precious, to canvass for complaints. Send me all your complaints, please. My predecessor, Jerry Burns, an outstanding public servant, once, as he said, in a fit of madness, decided he would do a television advertisement advertising for complaints to be sent to him. And unfortunately, he was overwhelmed. He didn't realize what white furniture was until he got complaints about washing machines and holidays that had gone wrong, and the whole world was against me. And I think that sort of undelineated approach is not an answer either. So I think we have to work through advocacy groups and other organisations that are out there now, like the Older Persons Commissioner, like the Young Persons Commissioners, to see how they can hopefully help us to make groups like that aware of our existence. And equally, I think where we have complaints, maybe reaching trusts to really sharpen up the referral arrangements. Because I think, again, this is a shocking reality, but I think a lot of people have real difficulty even committing to paper what their issue is. And people are sometimes inhibited, sometimes they lack the skills, and we have to look at how they can be facilitated because they're often the most vulnerable.
That links in really with my next question, which is about how does the Ombudsman's office ensure that the public know about it, what its role is, its role in relation to health-related complaints, and do you have any arrangements to monitor the effectiveness of the existing arrangements?
In terms of the knowledge of our existence and where we come or where we fit into the wider health and social care complaints procedure, we're actually mentioned in the health and social care complaints procedure, the 99-page document itself. We wouldn't see a problem with signposting. I'm fairly confident the trusts are au fait with our role, and there is signposting, actually at quite an early stage. There's been a lot of debate regionally at which point complainants should be directed to our office. And I think it's been agreed now to offer signposting to our office after the first substantial reply to a complaint. So in terms of that, we have our own literature internally as well that we make freely available, and we do get a lot of inquiries as well from members of the public. We're also keen to develop relationships with bodies like the Patient and Client Council, and we continue to network with them. And we also offer, presentations when we can that give examples from our caseload and up-to-date examples of the issues we're dealing with.
One of the things, Chairman, if I just will finalise this, that might be of relevance to the inquiry, and I'm sure an issue that you are aware of, is currently a piece of legislation is going through the Assembly which will modernise significantly the office and the way in which we transact our business. One of the very significant limitations on us is the whole issue of confidentiality and privacy and our ability to speak about specific cases. Now, a lot of that is going to be amended within the new legislation. And I think that will be a huge opportunity for us, because our colleagues in Wales, for example, our colleagues in Scotland, all produce monthly and quarterly digests of cases, which then are sent to media outlets, which are sent to MLAs and other public organisations that indeed gain visibility and profile for the office. And people can see individuals with similar issues to them, to the ones they have or whatever, having them reviewed. And I think that will be a huge benefit to us. We're assured that that legislation should be on the floor of the Assembly before Christmas, if not immediately after Christmas, and that if it gets a fair wind, and hopefully it will be adopted certainly by the spring, early summer, and that will, I think, transform the whole way in which we do our business and the way we are able to engage with the public. And I think that will address very particularly the issues about our visibility.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Paul.
Thank you both very much for your time this afternoon. Really appreciate it. And Tom, you do come with some unique experience, the combination of your present role and your previous, as it were. And a human rights-based approach to health, of course, is not a panacea. It's not a magic solution. There aren't any magic solutions to these immensely complex policy issues. But still, there is evidence that a human rights-based approach has a contribution to make to good policy making, good interventions, good programs, good projects. And as I tried to emphasize earlier, it is subject to progressive realization. It is subject to maximum available resources. There is evidence it empowers people, it empowers communities. It does require multidisciplinarity, and multidisciplinarity, in my opinion, requires some humility. Sometimes, perhaps, that's in short supply. It also requires, I think, specificity. And it's in relation to this that I'd really appreciate your professional guidance. It requires specificity, by which I mean that without specificity, a human rights-based approach to health generally can be almost overwhelming. It's so large, it's so complicated, it's very daunting. So I am wondering whether a way forward is something like as follows, but your critical comments would be appreciated. Taking one topic, like emergency care, and getting the right people in the room, and the right people being an array of health professionals, including those who are expert in emergency care, but also others as well, health information people, health systems people, and a range of others. And also getting in the room some human rights workers and some members of the public. And then in a very sort of roll up your sleeves type way, sitting down and trying to nut out together in a collegial way what a human rights-based approach means in relation to that specific issue of emergency care, or it could be palliative care or cancer care or whatever it might be, but let's stick with emergency care. And then over a period of 6 months or so, this group might meet quite regularly, exchange views, learn from each other, try and be operational, practical. Know what one of my colleagues calls no blah blah, real practical interventions. And gradually, it would be a learning process actually, gradually together, the health professionals broadly understood, human rights people broadly understood, with the public presence there too, gradually learning how to operationalize what a human rights-based approach to emergency care or other specific topic, what it might look like in hard, concrete, practical terms. And I wonder, and I'd be very interested, given your rich experience, I'd be very interested to know whether you think that sort of process might be one way forward to try and deepen our understanding of a human rights-based approach to emergency care.
Well, I think it's interesting, the sort of the proposal you put up. I mean, the reality is that this document in the Ombudsman's office, which is a much simpler environment, not as complex anyway, not as multifaceted, is exactly how we went about it. I mean, at the end of the day, we were very lucky to get an outstanding member of the Human Rights Commission staff to come across. She had been involved in a number of particularly challenging independent reviews on behalf of the Commission of areas like elderly care and so on. So she had a sense of the complexity. And she came and she literally, to use that word, which I suppose has all sorts of connotations now, became embedded with us and spent a lot of time understanding our procedures, our protocols, the sort of drivers that we had, the sort of pressure points we had. And she then began to look at our casework, and using our casework began to make the connections between our casework and how a human rights model might actually fit with us rather than some new thing we had to do, and actually how it might add value. And she would have engagement with individual staff who were in some instances very skeptical. Northern Ireland has not handled the human rights issue very well. It's been a very divisive issue here, and therefore it's got all sorts of issues for people as they come to terms with it. But I think over time, through those conversations and discussions, our people began to see that the dynamic and the dimensions of human rights could add real value to our work in individual complaints. And we could actually use a language and a currency that would make sense to the complainants because they were around the issues they were concerned about. Because as I often say in investigating complaints and again in speaking to clinicians, the patient or the patient's family don't understand that you're the most brilliant brain surgeon that ever worked. But they do understand dignity. They do understand respect. They do understand that they are being engaged with as a serious, involved person in this circumstance. And those are the issues that create the beginning of the unease and the skepticism and the uncertainty. And so if we can bring those things into play from the patient's perspective, or indeed from the complainant's perspective, if it comes to that, then I think we can get some ownership. So I think the idea, a bit like eating the elephant, is about small bites. It's about looking for, maybe emergency care is too complex, but looking to have successes, areas where we can actually make it work, and building out of that then a sort of a confidence that comes with this is something that actually helps and adds value. Obviously, in the context of your inquiry, it will be around emergency care. And the big thing I think that I would say is to get people, of course everyone won't be convinced of it, but I genuinely believe to do this work well, you need volunteers to begin with. And out of their commitment and energy and skill, I think there is the possibility, the real opportunity to build a different perspective, a different view of human rights and health than the one that's in a sense held us back to date.
sir.
The only thing I would add to that is one of the things that I think was particularly successful about that was that it was grounded in casework and case studies, and that people can really relate to individual experience. And when you have that detail of experience, it makes concepts like human rights much more easy to understand.
Thank you.
Tom, Michaela, thank you. Is there anything that we haven't covered that you'd just like to say as a kind of concluding note?
No, Chairman, no. I think we're very comfortable. We've had the opportunity to say what we wanted to say. I hope we've offered a response that makes some sense to you. We clearly have an interest in this. We look forward to your report because we will be now engaging with bodies in relation to this particular piece of work, which again could, no doubt, be given momentum by your own report and create a positive context for us. So thank you very much.
Thank you for that. That's been very helpful. Thank you.